Look, lots of people know different languages in the world, and translating the Bible from Greek and Hebrew is not very different from translating something from Spanish into English or whatever it is. There are many, many people who know these languages. There are millions of people who know Greek, including ancient Greek, on the planet at the moment. So the idea that there's been some big conspiracy to change the meaning in some fundamental way just doesn't make sense. It's a bit like saying, the stock market can't work because there are all these people who speak different languages. It's nonsense. We know it works, even though people are trading in different languages. So language is, sometimes translation goes wrong, and we can laugh about that. But most of the time it works okay. So the idea that somehow the Bible can't be transmitted seems to be nonsense.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Peter Williams, and we're going to be discussing his helpful book, Can We Trust the Gospels? Peter, it's such an honor. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you.
Let's start our conversation with the same place we started last time, and that's with a bit of the Peter Williams origin story. We've had new people join us since we last spoke, so I want to make sure they have a little bit of context for who you are. So for those encountering you for the first time in our talk today, what are a few things they need to know about you?
I'm 49, I'm married, I've got two wonderful children, and I'm in Cambridge, England, where I'm principal of Tyndale House, which is not the publisher, but it's the biblical studies research epicenter, really, for evangelical biblical studies in the world. And people come from around the world in order to study the Bible there.
And in terms of your academic background and specialization, if you had to point to that specific hat that defines your work, what would that be?
I've got a few degrees and I did a PhD at Cambridge University, and I suppose I'm an expert on Bible manuscripts and languages and those sorts of things.
One of the things that I found interesting, or at least that I was thinking about as I was going through the book, is I've read books from and know of other scholars who maybe followed a similar academic path to you, but they've ended up in a far different place in terms of how they feel about the scriptures. And so I'm curious, for you and your journey, what was that thing that allowed you to fully trust in the Gospels and say more broadly the Bible? You're traversing the same ground as others, yet you still believe in the Bible and have faith.
I had the privilege of growing up in a loving Christian family, and although neither of my parents got degrees, they liked to read and they were balanced people. I think that helped. Then going to university and diving deep into Bible studies, finding a lot of people, of course, in the university context, do not find the Bible to be trustworthy, went through a period of doubt and questioning, but by God's grace, just saw how the Bible has the answers to so many of the problems that we pose, and the answers to the questions that people are finding, the problems we can find with the Bible are in the Bible. So, and after many years, finally thinking about writing a book on the reliability of the Gospels, I thought about it for 20 years, and then finally I did it. It's only 4 hours if you listen on audio, but that's 5 years per 1 hour of audio. So I hope it's got good quality in there.
And I'd be curious to hear in terms of motivation, you could have written, and not to say you haven't written, other works that focus on the academic side of this, but why did you have a passion to deliver a book for, say, the lay reader or something that is for a more popular level reader?
I've written a few technical books that no one in the world has read. I wanted to write a entry-level book that was brief, making the case for the Gospels, that can be given out without embarrassment to anyone. And so my target audience was people who know nothing about Christianity, but are prepared to read up a certain amount. To make that case, because I've always seen there's a gap. There are books on the reliability of the Gospels which are quite technical and in-depth, and there are plenty of books written by lay people on how to trust the Bible, but actually written by a scholar explaining the grounds for trusting the Bible. There's a lot of gap there. And so what I wanted to do is, I was very disciplined with the footnotes. I only used one reference to modern literature and one reference to ancient literature for almost every point I wanted to make. But I wanted to make sure people can check down the sources, they can check it out, and I'm not just making this up. So I try to avoid all technical language, keep it simple, and explain it as it goes.
And next, I'd love for you to talk to us about the reason for the four gospels. So, in terms of when these were originally penned, what were the original authors intending and hoping to deliver to their audience?
They're trying to introduce people to Jesus. They are focusing very selectively on what they could say. A third to a quarter of any gospel is focused really on just that last week, the week of the Passion and Resurrection. So they're very selective. If you get Mark's gospel, it's only really got three main speeches of Jesus, chapter 4, chapter 7, chapter 13, with other odd things he said. So they are being very, very selective, but they are giving you a portrait of Jesus. And the fact that there are four of them, I think, is an advantage because it gives you more confidence in what they are saying, coming at it from different angles. It gives you a greater richness in terms of different angles on Jesus.
And when folks get into the book, they're going to discover that in that first part, you focus a lot on non-Christian sources that support what we encounter in the gospel. So what are some of those sources and what are some of the ways that they back up what we read in the gospels?
So I like to start with non-Christian sources because people will say, well, the Christian ones are biased. So let's start with some non-Christian sources. They just establish a few things. So Cornelius Tacitus, the Roman writer, very clearly identifies where Christ dies, that he dies in Judea, roughly when he dies. That's when Pontius Pilate was in charge. That helps us locate it to sometime within the year 26 and 36, that's when Christ was put to death. You could go to a writer like Pliny, who talks about an early Christian meeting and how they're treating Christ as God at that stage. You can go to a writer like the Jewish writer Josephus, who will talk about how Jesus had a brother called James, just as it tells you in the gospel. So there are certain things you can establish just based on non-Christian sources about Jesus, that he's real and when he was around.
A common claim that you hear often from people who want to oppose whether or not we can believe what we read in the scriptures, they'll say that things have been lost in translation, errors have crept in through the years. Is that a credible perspective?
I don't think so, really. I mean, look, lots of people know different languages in the world, and translating the Bible from Greek and Hebrew is not very different from translating something from Spanish into English or whatever it is. There are many, many people who know these languages. There are millions of people who know Greek, including ancient Greek, on the planet at the moment. So the idea that there's been some big conspiracy to change the meaning in some fundamental way just doesn't make sense. It's a bit like saying, the stock market can't work because there are all these people who speak different languages. It's nonsense. We know it works, even though people are trading in different languages. So language is, sometimes translation goes wrong, and we can laugh about that. But most of the time it works okay. So the idea that somehow the Bible can't be transmitted seems to me nonsense. I mean, the Old Testament, first part of the Bible, is written in Hebrew. Well, let's face it, there's a whole country called Israel where people speak Hebrew. Not quite the same Hebrew, but the idea that fundamentally the message can't get across because of translation just doesn't make any sense. There's a country called Greece. Lots of people there know Greek, slightly different Greek from Bible Greek. But again, it doesn't make any sense to say it's been lost in translation.
And in terms of manuscript evidence, obviously we're at a time when things are cataloged and digital photos are available and really more widely available than they've ever been. So in terms of manuscript evidence, how does that also help to support that what's been transmitted through the years is reliable?
Yeah, so more and more of the great European museums and other places are putting their libraries, their digital libraries, their manuscripts up online. So increasingly, if I want to look at a particular manuscript, I can get on my cell phone and often pull up the page I want to see. And this is just going to increase. So again, there's a lot of transparency here that Bible manuscripts don't belong to just one group like the Vatican or whatever. They are at all sorts of different countries and different museums and libraries, monasteries, and so on. And the idea that they have all at some point in the past got together to corrupt their Bibles together, again, doesn't make sense. So just as we know the internet has many paths, many bits of information moving around, it's exactly the same with Bible manuscripts. There are lots of them, and that means that there's never any group that can control them all.
Well, if you're ever up late at night, kind of flipping through channels, maybe you hit up the History Channel here in the States or something similar, you often come across shows talking about the Gnostic Gospels or Gospels that didn't make the cut and that have been lost through the years. Is there some truth that we should be looking at those other Gospels, or were they maybe not included, say, amongst the four Gospels for a reason?
Yeah, so I think there's an equivalent on TV of clickbait, isn't there? Where people want to draw people in, and there's no doubt that the idea that some secret is being kept from you is one of those things that draws humans in as a story. Then you can combine that with some true things, namely that there are particular manuscripts in particular places, and try and build something out of that. So the four Gospels we have that are in a Bible, just look up four Gospels on the web. Those four Gospels, they are the earliest Gospels. And then there are other things that are later, and they don't give you as an authentic a picture of Jesus. There's nothing to be scared of about them. They're worth reading. But at the end of the day, they simply don't know about the culture and the time of Jesus in the same way as the four Gospels do. You can take the four Gospels and do tests on them. Do they know the geography? Do they know the language? Do they know the political history? Do they know the sort of plants there are? And they fit the time and place of Jesus. These other Gospels generally don't.
Just to pull on that thread a little bit more, in terms of quoting somebody that we might read, say, at something written in the time of the Gospels, or attributing something to a specific author, how did practices back then differ from what we would normally do today in terms of quotations and attribution?
So I think we've got some concerns nowadays. We use footnotes, we use quotation marks. Back then they didn't. But the basic idea that you can say so-and-so said such and such, they said back then. But what we find is when we got the Gospels, when they're reporting the words of Jesus, they actually get closer to each other in wording than when they're giving you general narrative. And that, of course, is a sign that they really are reporting what Jesus said rather than making stuff up, because it's a pattern you can see across all four Gospels where they are converging when they are reporting things that Jesus said.
And in terms of the four Gospels not perfectly mirroring each other, should that be perceived as a positive thing, or is that a negative?
In principle, it could be either. You could have four different accounts and they're so different that they cast doubt on each other, or you could have four accounts which differ somewhat. So you think there's a level of independence here. And that's what I think we got with the Gospels. They've got a good distance from each other. They're sufficiently different, but they are not so wildly different that you think you can't hold them all together. So, I mean, I've been reading four Gospels for many years, and I think they do hold together. They fit together. They are often reporting slightly different ways, but not in such a way that you can't say that they're all true.
We're moving towards the time for us to wrap up here, Peter, but I want to give you a chance to comment on anything that we haven't specifically covered. So in terms of this conversation, anything else you'd like to throw into the mix?
Well, I just encourage people to read the Gospels. They're very short. They're only about 9 hours to read all four Gospels and read them again and again. And also to recognize that the person of Jesus is really amazing. And the message that you get in the Gospels really is the message which gives you life. It fits so much together with the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, that after you've read the Gospels, you really should go on to read that and the letters and so on.
And for the listeners who would like to go further after they read Can We Trust the Gospels, what are some other books or resources you'd recommend?
There are a few. I quite like Craig Blomberg's work on the reliability of the Gospels. People who want a bit more depth, Charles Hill wrote the book Who Chose the Gospels. There's a book called The Case for Jesus by a man called Brant Pitre, which is good to read. So I think there are some good resources out there on the reliability of the Gospels.
And for the listeners who'd like to connect with you, find out more about the work of Tyndale House, where are some of the places we can check you out on the web?
Yeah, so on the web, our website is tyndalehouse.com. And they can also follow me on Twitter at Dr. PJ Williams. And I sometimes am quite active.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Peter and find out more. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Peter Williams. Once again, our book today was Can We Trust the Gospels? To connect with Peter and find out more, a great place to start is the Tyndale House website. Once again, you can find that over at tyndalehouse.com. And Peter, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been truly an honor to have you back on the show.
Great to be with you.